July 25th, 1943, 22:30 hours. Somewhere over the North Sea, British airmen prepare for the most significant technological gamble of the air war. Inside the belly of a Lancaster bomber flying at 15,000 feet, the wireless operator clutches a bundle of narrow paper strips, each one precisely cut to half the wavelength of the German Würzburg radar system. His hands are trembling, not from cold, but from the knowledge of what he is about to release into the night sky. Around him, 746 other bombers stretch across the darkness in formation, each carrying identical bundles. In the operations rooms below, German radar operators track the massive British force with growing alarm. Their screens light up with what should be the most concentrated bomber stream of the war, a target of incalculable value. But in the next 30 seconds, everything they are looking at will become useless. As if on command, from the rear doors of hundreds of aircraft, millions upon millions of paper strips tumble into the atmosphere. The British have just switched off the Germans' ability to see anything at all. They have turned the night sky momentarily into electronic chaos. This was Operation Gomorrrah, and this was the moment that German air defense changed forever. What the Luftwaffe's gunners and night fighters faced that evening was not a new aircraft or a faster bomber. It was something far more elegant and far more devastating. It was a weapon made not of metal and explosives, but of paper and science. It was a device so simple that a child could understand it, yet so effective that it rendered obsolete an entire defensive strategy built over years of technological investment. The story of this remarkable invention begins not in the sky, but in the laboratories and drawing rooms of Britain's scientific establishment during the darkest hours of the war. By 1942, the German Luftwaffe had transformed itself from a defeated daylight air force into a formidable night bombing machine. Night after night, German bombers descended upon British cities with near impunity. The Blitz, which had seemed to ease after 1941, had merely evolved into something more systematic and more deadly. British pilots flying Spitfires and Hurricanes discovered a frustrating truth. You cannot shoot down what you cannot see. The German night bombers were operating in conditions where visual acquisition was nearly impossible, where radar had become the sole arbiter of who lived and who died in the darkness above Britain's cities. Yet Germany itself faced an even more catastrophic threat. By 1943, the British and American bombing offensive against Nazi Germany was accelerating exponentially. The Americans flew by day and the British by night, and together they were subjecting German cities and industrial centres to levels of destruction that threatened to strangle the German war effort. The Luftwaffe's commanders understood this perfectly. Their night fighter force, equipped with the latest Würzburg and Liechtenstein radar sets, had become Germany's principal defence against this onslaught. These radar systems were sophisticated instruments, capable of detecting aircraft at ranges up to 35 kilometres. The operators who staffed these stations were highly trained professionals, many of them veterans of years of electronic warfare. Germany had invested enormous resources in creating a layered defence that worked in concert across the night sky. The Germans believed they had solved the problem of defending their homeland in darkness. What the Germans did not know, however, was that British scientists and military planners were observing their system with meticulous attention. Every radar impulse was monitored, every frequency noted, every technical specification reverse engineered through a combination of captured equipment, signals, intelligence, and deduction. By early 1943, the British understood the Würzburg system more completely perhaps than the Germans themselves did. More importantly, they understood something even more valuable. They understood its profound vulnerability. The Würzburg operated on a specific frequency, approximately 560 MHz, and like all radar systems, it relied on the principle of reflection. A radar transmitter sends out a burst of electromagnetic energy, and that energy bounces off solid objects, returning as a faint echo to the receiver. The bigger the object and the closer it is, the stronger the echo. An aircraft moving through space at high speed creates a distinctive radar signature. The genius of what the British invented was almost absurdly simple in its conception. If one could introduce into the atmosphere a vast number of small reflectors, each cut precisely to resonate at the same frequency as the German radar, one could effectively blind the system by creating an overwhelming number of false echoes. Instead of seeing a clear formation of bombers approaching, the radar operator would see nothing but noise. The screen would fill with so much chaff and interference that sorting genuine targets from false ones became an impossibility. In its essence, the technology exploited the fact that radar cannot distinguish between genuine echoes from aircraft and false echoes from simple strips of metal, or, as the British discovered worked perfectly well, strips of paper coated with aluminium or covered in graphite. The innovation team at the Telecommunications Research Establishment at Malvern, under the direction of scientists who had spent years perfecting Britain's own radar defence systems, understood precisely what wavelengths, sizes and densities would create maximum disruption. The strips needed to be cut to exactly the right dimensions. Too long, and they would reflect multiple frequencies unnecessarily. Too short, and they would not provide sufficient reflective surface. The mathematical calculations were refined over months of testing. Each strip was cut to approximately 27 centimeters in length, roughly equivalent to the length of a ruler, and folded into bundles of 1,000 strips per package. A single 4-engine bomber could carry between 400 and 600 such bundles, meaning that a force of 1,000 bombers could disperse over 12 million individual strips into the sky in the space of a few minutes. The manufacturing process itself became a remarkable feat of industrial organisation. The paper strips could not simply be manufactured anywhere. They needed to be produced to exacting standards in factories that understood the precision required. The metal foil coating or graphite treatment needed to be applied with perfect uniformity. Any irregularities in width or length could compromise the effectiveness of the entire bundle. Production facilities were established at multiple locations across Britain, and at the peak of production, the factories were manufacturing millions of strips every week. The final product was simple enough that it might have been produced by any printing works, yet the tolerances involved meant that only the most carefully controlled facilities could produce them to the specification required. The bundle itself was equally simple but equally ingenious. The paper strips were compressed together and wrapped in paper, then packed into special cartons designed to release the contents in a controlled manner when dropped from an aircraft. Drop them too gently, and they would fall in a clump and be ineffective. Drop them from the wrong altitude and they would disperse improperly. The packaging and deployment method had to be as carefully engineered as the strips themselves. By July 1943, the process had been perfected. The first operational use of this remarkable weapon was scheduled to coincide with one of the heaviest raids of the war against Hamburg. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now, let us see what happened when this technology met reality. Operation Gomorrrah unfolded across 4 nights of devastating assault on the city of Hamburg. The first night, 24th July 1943, the bombers struck without the chaff, and the German defences responded with lethal efficiency. Anti-aircraft guns found their targets, night fighters scored kills, and the British suffered casualties. But on the second night, the chaff was deployed. As the bomber stream approached German airspace, the streams of paper strips began to fall. Radar operators across northern Germany watched their screens with growing confusion and alarm. Where they expected to see the clear blips of approaching bombers, they saw instead an amorphous cloud of echoes, filling their screens with electronic snow. The effect was not merely to obscure individual aircraft, it was to make the entire radar picture useless. Night fighter pilots, trained to trust the vectors provided by ground-based radar controllers, found themselves receiving guidance that was worse than useless. Controllers were sending them towards phantom formations, away from genuine threats. The psychological impact on the German defenders was profound. They had come to believe that their radar systems made them invincible. That night provided them with safety. Suddenly, that safety was an illusion. The British bombers could fly through their defences virtually unhindered. On that second night of Gomorrah, casualties fell dramatically compared to the first night. The German defenders had been rendered effectively blind. In the following weeks and months, the chaff dispersion technique was refined. Different names emerged for the technology in different quarters. The British called it window. The Germans, furious and alarmed by its introduction, called it Dupel, after an island in the Baltic where some of their captured equipment had allegedly originated. Whatever the name, the effect was revolutionary. Subsequent raids on Hamburg, Berlin, and other German targets saw the consistent application of the technique. The German night fighter force, which had seemed capable of inflicting unlimited casualties on British bombers, suddenly found itself fighting partially blind. The implications were extraordinary. The entire German air defence strategy, based on the assumption that sophisticated radar systems would provide an impenetrable detection network, had been rendered obsolete in moments. The German response to this technological challenge was both rapid and considerable. Engineers and scientists worked urgently to develop countermeasures. They experimented with operating their radar systems on different frequencies, hoping to find bands where the chaff would be less effective. They developed new radar techniques and new display systems. Yet each innovation by the Germans was met with a corresponding innovation by the British. The British, having pioneered the technique, maintained a technological advantage in this deadly electronic game. American scientists, observing the success of Window, rushed to develop their own versions for deployment with American bomber forces. The Americans called their version chaff, a name derived from the agricultural term for the husks of grain. The chaff that the Americans produced was fundamentally the same technology as the British Window, though the dimensions and specifications were adjusted slightly for use against German radars at different frequencies. By the end of 1943, chaff and Window were being deployed by both British and American bombers on virtually every raid into German airspace. The Germans had never faced anything comparable. Their radar specialists worked frantically to understand the physics of what was happening and to devise electronic countermeasures. They eventually succeeded in developing new radar frequencies and new techniques for filtering out the chaff signals, but by then, the damage had been done. The momentum of the air war had shifted decisively towards the Allies. The impact of Window and chaff on the course of the air war cannot be overstated. Prior to the introduction of the technology, British bomber losses to German night fighters had been running at approximately 5 to 7% of aircraft dispatched. This rate was unsustainable. Aircrew knew that the odds of completing a tour of 30 operations were grim. After the introduction of Window, the casualty rates fell to approximately 1 to 2%. This reduction represented the difference between an air force being slowly ground down into irrelevance and an air force capable of maintaining operations. The lives saved by this simple innovation were counted in thousands. More broadly, the introduction of Window and chaff demonstrated a fundamental principle that would shape warfare for the remainder of the 20th century, that electronic warfare, conducted in the invisible realm of radio waves and radar frequencies, could be just as decisive as any physical weapon. The German Luftwaffe possessed no technical advantage after Window. They possessed no secret weapon that could overcome the British and American air superiority that had been secured, at least in part, by clever young scientists poring over radar circuits and calculating the precise dimensions of paper strips. The surviving examples of the technology still exist today. At the Imperial War Museum in London, visitors can see the actual packaging and bundles of Window, as it was deployed during the Second World War. The strips themselves are fragile, yellowed with age, yet they retain their reflective coating. A single bundle looks almost pathetic when examined closely, a modest collection of paper and foil that could fit in a hand. Yet millions of these bundles, falling from the sky like electronic confetti, changed the course of the air war. The legacy of Window and chaff extends far beyond the Second World War. Every modern military aircraft carries electronic warfare systems descended conceptually from the principles demonstrated by that first deployment over Hamburg. The radar systems installed on modern military aircraft include sophisticated filtering systems designed to reject chaff reflections and isolate genuine targets. Yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged: the ability to deny an enemy information, to create confusion in their sensory systems, to force them to process false data alongside genuine data, remains as valuable in warfare as it was in 1943. The electronic warfare doctrine that emerged from Window and chaff formed the foundation upon which generations of military strategists built their theories of air dominance and electronic countermeasures. Yet it is important to acknowledge that the effectiveness of Window and chaff was not absolute, and that its impact, while very real and very significant, has sometimes been exaggerated in popular accounts. The German defences were not rendered completely ineffective by the chaff. German night fighters continued to achieve kills throughout 1943 and beyond through a combination of visual interception, infrared detection, and improved radar techniques. The technology provided the British and Americans with an advantage, a significant advantage, but not a guarantee of invulnerability. German scientists eventually developed effective filtering techniques and frequency-agile radar systems that could operate even in the presence of heavy chaff. The The advantage that the Allies enjoyed remained, but it required constant refinement and evolution. Electronic warfare, as it emerged from the crucible of the Second World War, proved to be a competition without end, a constant back and forth between those seeking to blind their enemies and those seeking to retain their vision. The night of July 24th, 1943, now fades into history, a moment when the darkness over Germany suddenly became less forgiving, less protective. The German defenders who had felt safe behind their radar screens suddenly felt exposed. The bomber crews who had accepted casual loss rates as the price of their mission suddenly found those odds shifting in their favor. A simple invention, born from mathematics and physics, from the understanding of how electromagnetic waves behave and reflect, had altered the balance of the air war in a single night. The strips of paper and foil that fell from aircraft over Hamburg represented not merely a new weapon, but a new way of thinking about warfare itself. They demonstrated that superiority in the air did not necessarily belong to the fastest aircraft or the most heavily armored. It belonged increasingly to whoever could master the invisible realm of electrons and radio waves. The German Luftwaffe had invested years and enormous resources in building a sophisticated radar defense network. That network, rendered obsolete in minutes by millions of paper strips falling from the sky, represented a profound lesson in the limits of defensive technology and the power of clever innovation. The British scientific establishment had looked at the problem facing their bomber force and had not reached for a more powerful engine or thicker armor. They had reached for science itself, for mathematics, for fundamental understanding of how the enemy system worked. In that choice lay the seed of the electronic age that would come to define 20th century warfare. The radar operator below, staring at his useless screen filled with electronic snow, knew in that moment that the war had changed. Everything he had trained for, everything he had relied upon had just become obsolete. In the sky above him, the bombers pressed on into the darkness, finally, briefly, invisibly free.